Hello and welcome to the video. So this time we're going to be looking at putting together this chap, which is a Hellraiser Pinhead skull. Now this is something that I've been making for a recent venture that I'd mentioned in a recent video, which is this Etsy store that you can see here. Now I've got plenty of regular skulls on here, but I couldn't resist doing some sci-fi and horror themed skulls as well. So there's a few sort of film related ones on there as well, and this Pinhead skull is part of that. Now I'm sure it won't come as much of a surprise that I'm a bit of a Hellraiser fan, and as you can see we've got a Pinhead up here. In fact, much of this cabinet is filled with sort of Hellraiser and Hellraiser related items. These ones down here are actually designed by Clive Barker and in combination with Todd McFarlane, and they're produced by Todd McFarlane's company. Really cool. In fact, they're better than most of the Cenobites in the Hellraiser sequels, so I do wonder why they didn't bother making a film with these guys instead of what they came up with for the sequels. I've actually got a video about my collection that you can see behind me on the channel, so if you're interested you can check that out and get a little bit more information. So in this video we're going to be looking at putting this guy together, so let's get started. We have such sights to show you. So this actually started life way back when I did my original skull sculpting video on the channel. I had a smaller version that I'd been working on. It had quite a pronounced jawline that I quite liked the look of, and so I went on to develop that into some badges that I was selling at steampunk events. I really liked the look of those and I wanted to develop them further, so what I did was to pour some molten monster clay into the mould, and that gave me a new version of the sculpture. I then developed it further into a full skull that you can see here. Now this was one of the original pieces that I made for my Etsy store, and I've already moulded this guy up, and when he came out of the mould he was actually in really good shape, so I wanted to reuse the sculpture for something. So I started thinking, well, maybe I could do the Pinhead sculpture on this. All I would really need to do is cut the grid into the skull, you know, obviously put some pins in, and that would basically be it. So it seemed like a fairly quick job to do, so that's what I decided to do. So to that end I started tracing the grid into the skull. Now this actually proved a little bit more tricky than I originally thought. The skull itself, although it's you know, it's a finished sculpture, it's not exactly accurate. You know, obviously if you're sculpting by hand you're never going to get sort of 3D modelling degrees of accuracy. So some of the curves aren't quite uniform over the sculpture, you know, some of the contours aren't, but you know, that's what goes into a handmade sculpture. But cutting a geometric grid into an uneven curved surface actually proved a little bit tricky, so I did find myself going back and forth over this quite a lot. Now as it happened I have had a go at sculpting Pinhead before, and here's the head of my original version. And so I've sort of gone through a lot of the problems with trying to figure out the grid shape for the sculpture already, so I've got a fairly good handle on how it should look. Nevertheless, I did find myself going back and forth over this quite a bit, just trying to get it correct. Now of course this is a skull, it's not a face, so it doesn't actually have all of the features that a regular face would. You know, it doesn't have a nose and it doesn't have cheeks, so some of the areas where the pins would normally go just aren't there. So I had to compromise slightly just to make sure the design actually fit onto a skull. I concentrated on getting half of the design finished first. I found that quite a useful technique. Get half of it done, and once you've got that correct you can then just mirror it onto the other side of the skull, so it just sort of gives you a bit of a guide to work against. So here's the finished sculpture, and this is actually ready for moulding. I've put some channels here with some wire, and they're just going to form air channels in the mould, so when I pour my resin in, the air can escape. So here's my mould, and hopefully you can see inside there that there's actually some very fine detail on the inside of the mould. And what this is that I actually pushed into the sculpture with a sculpting tool to create indents where the pins would go. Now I didn't actually think that the mould would pick these up, but it did. So when I got my cast out of the mould, I actually found that a lot of the holes where I was going to put the pins were already there. So that actually ended up being really useful, even though it was a complete accident, because I was envisaging having to drill like 100 holes in order to put the pins into the sculpture. But in actual fact, there was already some holes in the sculpture in the first place, so it actually made the job much easier when I came to actually put the pins in. So I've trimmed and cleaned up my cast, and as you can see this is one of a batch that I'm working on. So the painting process for these is actually exactly the same as any of the other skulls that I've featured on the channel so far. What I do is to give it a coat of burnt umber oil paint, and then I just thin that with white spirit, cover the whole thing, and then wipe it down as well as I can. So it sort of gives it a weathering pass, and all of the paint gets into the details in the sculpture, and it sort of gives you that lovely sort of aged bone look. So it's quite an easy painting process to do. As you can see though, it does create a massive mess, so I've actually used some plastic here just to shield the work area. It looks like something with brown blood has been murdered, so it's a bit of a state, but nevertheless it does make the white resin really look like bone, so it's really cool. Here's also another one that's on the go. This is my tentacle skull, and this is actually a sculpture of my tattoo that my fiancé designed for me. So this is going to be joining the ranks of the skull soon. I need to do a little bit more work on this though. It needs to have the tentacles painted before I come in and give it the bone pass, basically. So that's going to be one for another day. So the final part of the painting process is to come in with an airbrush and just give it some shading with some black. Obviously these are quite small, so you don't get the shadows in the eyes and the cavities that you would normally get, so you need to replicate that just with some black paint. So I generally just give some shading around the eyes, nose, and around the jaw, and around the sides of the head, and that's about it really, so it's quite a quick and easy process. Right, so we're now at the stage where we can start pushing the pins in. Now, as I mentioned, some of the holes that I pushed into the sculpture are already present in the resin, so that can make this really, really easy. When I originally did this, I used some pliers, but I swiftly found that I needed something more because I couldn't get the pins into the sculpture in a uniform height. They were all slightly off. So what I did was to make this tool, which is just a piece of mild steel with a hole drilled on the centre, and I've given it a handle to make it easy to handle. So what you do is you put your nail into the end of this tool, and then just push it into the resin. Like I said, there's a lot of holes in the resin already, so that makes it quite easy, but also the resin's relatively soft, so even if there isn't a hole in a particular position, it's not too hard to push a pin directly into the resin. Now this might look a bit laborious, but it's actually quite a fun process, so I quite enjoy putting all the pins in. Now I'm doing this for camera, so I'm sort of holding it out in front of my body when I'm doing it, and that's actually a little bit more tricky than how I'd normally do it. I'd normally have it quite close to my chest to get a bit more force on it. If you do get one off centre, you can just bend it back into shape. These are 1mm panel pins, so they're pretty easy to bend. Now one thing I did find is that once you've got half of the pins in the head, it starts getting quite tricky to do the other half because you're pushing the pins that are already in the skull into the palm of your hand. So I might need to think about making some sort of jig or something to hold this thing, otherwise I'm going to really do my hand in. But that would probably be a waste of good suffering now, wouldn't it? So I'm going to jump ahead here to a point where I'm almost finished. So at this stage I've got most of the nails in the head done. Now for the lower face, because these areas of resin are a little bit thinner, I actually need to start drilling out some of the holes just so I don't split the resin. This is my prototype, and I don't know if you can really see here, but in some locations the resin has actually cracked on the thinner areas, and that's just because it's just a little bit thin, so if you're driving a nail in there, it doesn't take much to actually break the resin. So for these lower areas I'm actually going to drill a hole with a small drill just so I don't get that effect. Now to be honest with you, I don't really mind the cracked look. I think it sort of makes sense that the nails would crack the skull in some areas where they go in, so maybe it doesn't matter too much, but just so I don't completely destroy the thing, it's a bit easier to drill some holes before putting the pins in. Now for the nose here I actually need to remove the forehead pins, that gets in the way of the pin protruding from the nose. Right, so there we go, so we've got all the pins in. And as you can see on the jaw, occasionally that'll show through, but again, I don't think that really matters, it sort of makes sense. Now I don't know if you can see on the top here, but just where my finger is, along one of the lines that I've cut into the sculpture, the resin has actually cracked. I think it's quite interesting because when I did the original batch of pinheads, I did them shortly after I'd cast the skulls up, so I think the resin was still relatively fresh, so when I pushed the pins in, I think there was still a bit of give in the resin, so it was relatively easy and the resin didn't really crack too badly. But on these ones, they've actually been in a box for a week or so I can actually hear cracking in the resin as I was pushing the pins in. And I know that polyurethane resin cures over a period of time, so I think it was just the fact that the resin hadn't fully cured when I did the original batch, whereas with these more recent ones it's fully cured and so they're a little bit more brittle. But as you can see, I do have quite a lot of these on the go at the minute, and the desk's sort of partially covered with them. Right, so I've got my sculpture finished, so what I now need to do is put it on a base. Now I've been casting up a bunch of stuff recently. As you can see, I've got a box of skulls here, ready to go. What I've also got is a box of bases. And these are just casts of a piece that I turned on the lathe, so it's got kind of a nice sort of chest-like look to it, a bit like a chess piece. So I'm going to use that for my base. So that's going to do for my base. So the first part is to drill a hole into the top of it. I've got the centre point marked, but I need to drill in a hole that's a little bit deeper. And what I need to do is cut down a length of brass rod. And I can just clean the edges of that up on the belt sander. Right, so now that I've got those two bits together, what I can now do is come over to the polishing wheel and start buffing this up. Now you've got to be a little bit careful with it and have quite a good grip on it, because this thing loves grabbing stuff and launching it at the wall behind, which obviously doesn't too well if you're trying to have a nice smooth base. But what I found with this resin is you can actually buff it up quite nicely and get quite a nice shine on it. So that's what I'm doing here. So as you can see, that's looking pretty good. And the last part of this is I actually need to give the brass a bit of a polish as well. Right, so I'm just going to rough the end up there, because what I'm going to do is drill a hole in the skull and then super glue this in place. So I'm just roughing up the end so that the super glue's got something to grip on. Right, so this is a difficult bit. It's always a little bit tricky to get this exactly aligned, so you've got to be very, very careful with it. I've done this a few times and got it a little bit wonky. So what I find a good way to go is to actually drill a centre hole, just so I've got the alignment correct. Then I can angle the drill to get the actual pose that I want. And if you really do go wrong, you can just drill the hole a little bit wider than you need, and then put some super glue in to actually fill the gap. So there's a bit of wiggle room, but you know, it's always nice to get the hole correct first time so it's aligned. So let's have a look. I've sort of got that in. I think unfortunately he's leaning a little bit too far forward, though I don't mind that look, to be honest, but yeah, it's a little bit too far forward, so I'm just going to slightly recorrect that and then whack a bunch of super glue in there to hold it in place. Okay, not looking too bad. So I've got a little bit of super glue on the base, so I'm just going to come back in with the airbrush and just spray some more black over that to sort of join those two pieces together and hide where the super glue is. So there's one final aspect to this. I just want to give the teeth a little bit more definition. Although I've obviously given it a wash of brown paint already, I think the teeth are something that you kind of want to stand out a little bit more. So what I'm doing is taking some brown paint, this is Tamiya paint, and I'm just using some isopropyl alcohol to thin it out. So that sort of turns it into a bit of a wash and lets it flow into the detail in the gaps between the teeth. What I can then do is come in with a cotton bud or a Q-tip, I think they're called in the US, and just use that with a bit more isopropyl alcohol to clean up the teeth a little bit further. Right, so I think that's about it for this one. I must say I had a good fun putting this guy together. Putting all those pins in, like I said, is quite therapeutic actually. I wonder if I could market these as sort of spiky stress balls or something like that. So like I said, these are available in my Etsy store, and thanks very much to those of you who have already ordered one. I really do appreciate it. It really helps support the channel. So I think that's it for this one. So thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you'd like to support the channel, then please do give us a like and subscribe and all the usual YouTube stuff. The more concrete way of supporting the channel is heading over to my Etsy store, which is the Sculpture Studio, where I have a variety of skull-based sculptures for those who are interested in such things. If you'd like to follow what I do, I'm also on Instagram and Facebook. Just search for The Dark Pal.